Winter arrived quietly, as it always did, slipping into the house like a pale shadow. I woke to the subtle chill that seeped under the window frames, curling around the edges of the thick curtains. The morning was still, the kind of stillness that makes the air feel heavier, pressing softly against the skin. I could smell the faint residue of last night's tea, mingling with the dry, cold scent of the snow that had begun to settle outside. The floorboards beneath my bare feet creaked faintly as I moved, each step slow, deliberate. I liked listening to those soft creaks. They reminded me I was home, that the house was alive in its quiet, familiar way. The walls, painted a faded cream, seemed warmer in the dim morning light, though the shadows clung stubbornly to the corners of the rooms. I ran a hand over the railing of the stairs. The wood was cold, almost damp under my palm, smooth in some places, rough in others, and I let my fingers linger, tracing its imperfections. In the kitchen, the kettle waited on the stove, still cold, untouched. I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator, steady and low, grounding me in the ordinary rhythm of life. I paused, inhaling slowly, noticing the faint, almost imperceptible smell of cinnamon lingering from yesterday's baking. My mind wandered to the small comforts of these quiet mornings, the way my sister always left her mug on the edge of the counter, how my brother would shuffle past with bare feet, muttering something under his breath, how my parents moved with careful predictability, like the house itself had trained them. It was comforting. It was known. Yet, beneath the surface of this calm, there was a whisper I couldn't place, a sensation that the world was not quite as solid as it seemed. I tried to dismiss it, blaming fatigue, imagination, the edges of sleep still clinging to me. But even as I told myself it was nothing, I felt my chest tighten slightly, a quiet awareness that some detail might be shifting just beyond my perception. I walked to the living room slowly, noticing the way the light of the low winter sun flickered through the curtains, scattering faint patterns across the carpet. The air was colder here, heavier. I could see my breath faintly, and it made the room feel simultaneously larger and more confining. The furniture smelled faintly of polish, dust, and the lingering warmth of last night's presence. I ran a finger along the edge of the coffee table. The surface was smooth but cool, and I lingered on the texture, letting the small sensations anchor me. Sitting down, I felt the quiet rhythm of the house settle around me, the subtle creaks and groans of its frame, each sound amplified in the emptiness. I could hear my own heartbeat, slow and deliberate, matching the pulse of the house. My thoughts wandered lightly, almost teasingly, to nothing in particular: the path of the sun across the floor, the distant echo of a car on the street, the way the shadows seemed to shift imperceptibly as the light changed. For a long moment I let myself simply be. I watched a small patch of sunlight move across the rug, noting how it touched the fibers, how it warmed the threads unevenly. I thought about the rituals of this house, the comfort of habits repeated endlessly, the way everything seemed predictable, unchanging. And yet, there was a tension beneath it all, almost imperceptible, like a string pulled too tight. I could not name it, could not confront it, and perhaps that made it all the more present. I sipped from my mug. The tea was faintly sweet, hot but not scalding, grounding me in the simplicity of the moment. My mind circled again, gently, cautiously, to the patterns of the house, the subtle movements, the small noises that always went unnoticed. I imagined conversations that might happen, rehearsed questions, unspoken acknowledgments, all while the world outside continued its quiet, relentless motion. And in that stillness, I understood something I could not yet name, that the calm of this house, the comfort of its predictability, was both a sanctuary and a warning. Something, faint and delicate, whispered at the edges of my awareness. Something was not wrong, at least not yet, but the sensation lingered, pressing softly against the inside of my chest, insistent, patient. I stayed in the living room, watching the light move across the carpet, listening to the subtle sounds of a house breathing, of a family yet to stir. The cold pressed gently at the windows, the shadows shifted almost imperceptibly, and I felt the slow, deep rhythm of anticipation settle inside me. It was quiet, it was slow, and it was inexorable. It was on a New Year's Eve, a few years later, that I first noticed something off. I woke sometime after midnight, stirred by a sound so faint it could have been imagined, a rustling from the kitchen, a soft scraping, a movement just beyond the edge of perception. I held my breath, listening. The air in my room felt colder than usual, sharper, pressing against my skin. I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen, the slow, irregular creak of the floorboards in the hall. Each sound seemed magnified in the silence, as if the house itself were leaning closer to observe. I hesitated, torn between the pull of curiosity and the comfort of staying in bed, wrapped in the warmth of my blankets. My thoughts circled. Perhaps it's just the wind. Perhaps it's a branch brushing against the window. But the rational explanations did little to settle the unease curling in my chest. I slipped out of bed, the cold floor a shock against my bare feet. I moved slowly, deliberately, each step measured, listening to the soft groan of the boards. The hallway stretched before me, dimly lit by the pale moonlight spilling through the window at the far end. Shadows pooled in corners, stretching and shrinking as the light shifted with the wind outside. I could almost feel them, pressing faintly against my senses, as though waiting for me to notice. Reaching the kitchen doorway, I paused. The faint smell of tea lingered, mingled with the crisp scent of winter air that had seeped in through the cracked window. My heart beat steadily, though a small, insistent prickle of fear ran along my spine. The kettle sat untouched on the stove, exactly as I remembered it. The counters were clear. The chairs were pushed in. And yet, something was different. I took a cautious step forward, my fingers brushing the edge of the table. The wood was cool under my touch, its surface familiar, yet somehow alien. My mind raced, trying to make sense of the shift. Did I move something yesterday and forget? Was it just my imagination? I repeated the questions silently, trying to anchor myself, to reason away the tightening in my chest. A small, almost imperceptible movement caught my eye. One of the photo albums, usually resting neatly on the shelf above the sink, lay on the floor. The corner was slightly bent. I stared, holding my breath. I knew it had not been there before. The rational part of my mind whispered, "It fell. Gravity. Perhaps a slight nudge." But another, quieter voice insisted, "No one touches it. No one disturbs it. Not like this." I knelt slowly, my knees creaking softly against the cool tile. The shadows seemed to stretch closer, almost leaning in to watch. I picked up the album, feeling the faint texture of the cover beneath my fingers, the subtle warmth from where my hand rested. I opened it slowly, scanning the familiar photographs. Smiling faces, frozen moments of birthdays and vacations, the subtle constancy of our lives captured on paper. Everything appeared normal. Everything was as it should be. Yet, even as I breathed in the familiar sense of paper and polish, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, that a thin crack had formed in the quiet foundation of our home. My chest tightened again, a slow, pressing awareness that someone, or something, had shifted the balance. I told myself to sit, to breathe, to let it pass. But the tightness lingered, insistent. I straightened, letting the album rest against my chest. The house remained silent. The faint rustle I had heard had stopped. Even the wind outside seemed to hesitate, holding its breath. I tried to shake the feeling, telling myself it was nothing, just the imagination of a sleepless mind. But the moment stretched. The shadows in the corners deepened, and I realized, with a slow, sinking certainty, that I was not imagining everything. Something small had moved, something subtle, and yet it had left an impression that would not fade. I placed the album back on the shelf, each movement deliberate and slow, and stepped back. The kitchen was quiet again. The kettle gleamed dully under the moonlight. My fingers lingered on the counter for a moment, feeling the cold smoothness, tracing the edges, trying to reassure myself that nothing had changed. But I knew, deep down, that the house was no longer entirely predictable. A thread had been pulled, a faint tremor in the rhythm of our lives. and though I could not yet name it, a quiet tension had begun to seep into the corners of my awareness, subtle, patient, waiting. I retreated back down the hallway, each step slow, deliberate, as if by moving too quickly I might disturb something fragile and unspoken. My bedroom door closed with a soft click, the familiar comfort of the blankets and warmth wrapping around me, yet I could not shake the unease pressing softly against the edges of my mind. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to the silence of the house. It was ordinary, but tinged now with the faint, persistent knowledge that the world, our world, might not be as unchanging as I had always believed. The days that followed were quiet, almost painfully ordinary. Yet, beneath the familiar rhythm of the house, a subtle tension lingered. I found myself noticing small details I had never paid attention to before, the way a chair seemed slightly askew, the faint scent of something unidentifiable in the corners of the living room, the soft creak of a floorboard that hadn't moved in years. Each observation gnawed at me quietly, like a thread slowly unraveling a tapestry. I tried to dismiss them, telling myself that the mind exaggerates, that tiredness or memory could create illusions. Yet the awareness persisted, patient, insistent, growing like a shadow that expands imperceptibly. On the next New Year's Eve, the subtle strangeness returned, amplified. I awoke to the faint whisper of movement in the hallway. I froze, listening. The air smelled different that night, colder, sharper, tinged with a faint, metallic edge I couldn't place. My heart thudded quietly, a steady rhythm that seemed to synchronize with the house's own slow pulse. I stepped carefully into the hallway, each footfall measured, the floor cold beneath me. Shadows clung stubbornly to the corners, stretching and shrinking with the flicker of the moonlight. I noticed that the pattern of furniture had shifted ever so slightly. The armchair by the window was not where it had been the evening before, its fabric brushing against the rug in a way that drew attention I could not ignore. I crouched to examine the details, my fingers tracing the edges, noting the subtle changes in texture and weight. Was it the wind? Did someone else enter the house while we slept? Or is it just me? The questions circled in my mind, echoing softly, almost like a conversation with myself. I felt the tug of rationality and fear pulling in opposite directions. I wanted to act, to investigate, to understand, but I also wanted to retreat, to preserve the fragile comfort of the known. By the time the rest of the family stirred, I had already noticed more. A small book had disappeared from its usual shelf, a faint indentation in the carpet suggested something had been moved, and a chair in the dining room now faced a different angle than it ever had before. Every minor change, trivial on its own, compounded into a growing sense of disquiet, a pattern my mind could not ignore. At breakfast, no one mentioned it. My parents carried on with the usual conversations, my sister hummed softly, my brother fumbled with his mug, yet I felt an unspoken tension in the air, as if everyone was aware of the subtle shifts and choosing not to acknowledge them. I caught myself watching faces, searching for a flicker of recognition, a sign that someone else noticed. But no one met my gaze for long. Later that day, I revisited the spots where the minor disturbances had occurred. I pressed my hands against the cold wooden surfaces, ran my fingers along the edges of rugs, traced the texture of fabric. Every small change anchored the growing suspicion in my mind. Something was repeating. Something was consolidating. There was a pattern, and I was beginning to see it, even if I could not yet name it. I walked through the house slowly, each step deliberate. I paused at windows, feeling the thin chill of frost creeping along the edges. I inhaled the sharp winter air, filling my lungs deliberately, trying to steady my thoughts. Shadows lengthened and shifted with each flicker of the streetlight outside, and I realized with a small, sinking certainty that the quiet of the house was no longer absolute. There was movement, subtle and persistent, that had its own rhythm and logic, one I could sense but not control. By evening, the unease had grown into a companion I could not ignore. It whispered quietly at the edges of my mind. Pay attention. Notice. Remember. And I did. I observed every minor anomaly, catalogued every small shift, each one embedding itself into my awareness. I could feel the pattern forming, a lattice of subtle disruptions across our daily life, knitting together into something inevitable. Sitting alone later that night, I tried to force myself to see it rationally, to name the changes in a practical, mundane way. But the awareness refused simplicity. Each object, each shadow, each faint smell seemed to carry intention, and I began to understand, with a slow, creeping clarity, that whatever was happening would continue. It was patient, it was deliberate, it was real. And I, despite my awareness, did nothing. I watched, I noticed, I catalogued, and with every passing hour, the tension in the house coiled tighter, patient, waiting, almost expectant. I realized that the repetition was no longer random, it was a signal, and though I could not yet act, I felt the quiet inevitability of what was coming, pressing softly, unrelentingly against the edges of my mind. The days after the second New Year passed in a strange, heavy rhythm. I could feel it in the house, like the air itself had thickened, pressing gently against my skin, infiltrating my thoughts. Every small sound, the hum of the refrigerator, the faint creak of a floorboard, the whisper of wind brushing against the windows, carried a weight I could not shake. I began to notice patterns I could not explain, small, subtle movements that had no logical source. I questioned myself constantly. Am I imagining it? I would ask silently, pacing slowly through the hallways, tracing the familiar contours of furniture with my fingers, seeking proof of normality. Am I tired? Is my mind playing tricks? But each small discrepancy, the tilt of a picture frame, the angle of a chair, the faint indentation on the carpet, persisted, stubborn, undeniable. The house itself seemed to respond to my attention. Shadows lengthened as I lingered, light flickered subtly, and the air shifted, cool one moment, almost suffocating the next. I could feel it brushing against my face, a whisper of cold that moved unpredictably. I breathed slowly, trying to calm myself, counting each exhale, willing reason into the patterns I could not yet name. I remembered the first time I had noticed the album on the floor, the strange rustling in the kitchen, and I felt a pang of guilt I could not define. Should I have acted then? Should I have investigated? My mind circled endlessly, revisiting old choices and inaction, tracing the quiet mistakes that now seemed to ripple through the house. I realized I was cataloging everything, like a silent observer in a house that no longer entirely belonged to the ordinary world I had known. I began talking to myself quietly, almost under my breath, as if the words could anchor me. It's nothing. Just the house. Just winter. Just shadows. And yet, I knew the shadows were more than mere absence of light. They shifted with intent, like echoes of something unseen, deliberate, watching. Am I overreacting? Am I too late? The questions multiplied, each one heavier than the last, pressing down on my chest with a slow, unyielding weight. I revisited old memories, moments that had seemed trivial at the time. A misplaced mug, a chair moved slightly, the sound of a floorboard at an odd hour. I realized these were not isolated incidents, they were repetitions, threads in a pattern I had failed to recognize. The quiet accumulation of these minor anomalies formed a lattice of inevitability, and I could not escape it. Every evening, I walked the house slowly, deliberately, testing each object, examining every surface. The texture of the carpet beneath my fingers, the cool polish of the table, the smoothness of the window glass, all became anchors to measure against the creeping sense of wrongness. And yet, nothing I touched or observed could offer certainty. Each correction, each adjustment, felt temporary, as if the house itself resisted permanence. I tried to rationalize, creating elaborate explanations in my mind. Perhaps a shift in temperature caused the objects to move slightly, perhaps someone in the family unconsciously adjusted things, perhaps fatigue clouded my perception. But none of these explanations satisfied me. Each felt like a fragile shield against an encroaching truth I dared not name. Night fell, and with it came the quiet certainty that something was approaching, though I did not yet know what. I could feel the weight of inevitability pressing through the walls, through the air, through the very floor beneath my feet. My mind circled endlessly, imagining consequences, rehearsing choices I had not made, revisiting the thread of inaction that now tied me to the subtle disarray around me. I understood, in a slow, creeping clarity, that the house and its disturbances were patient. They were deliberate, and I, despite my awareness, had done nothing. The realization settled deep within me, a cold, persistent pressure. The pattern was forming, consolidating, and I was part of it, helpless, observing the gentle, inexorable rhythm of change that I could neither alter nor halt. And in the quiet, I felt the slow tightening of inevitability, the oppressive weight of knowledge that one day, very soon, the pattern would demand its full measure, and no reasoning, no hesitation, could stop it. I lay awake that night, listening to the subtle groans of the house, tracing the faint movements in the shadows, counting each breath as if it were a fragile tether to reality. And I knew, with a certainty that made my chest ache, the following New Year's Eve arrived like a slow tide, indistinct at first, then insistent. I could feel it in the air. The house seemed denser, the shadows deeper, the cold sharper against my skin. The faint creak of the floorboards echoed through the hallways, each step of mine magnified in the silence. I moved deliberately, almost ritualistically, testing the rhythm of the house, listening for the faintest anomaly. In the kitchen, the kettle sat on the stove, the faint smell of last night's tea still clinging to the air. My family moved around me in their quiet, habitual ways. My sister hummed softly as she poured milk into her mug. My brother adjusted the salt and pepper on the table. My parents carried on with the usual conversation, discussing trivial matters. Appointments, groceries, nothing of consequence. Everything appeared ordinary, and yet I felt the subtle pull of unease, the persistent awareness that the pattern was forming again, slowly, imperceptibly. I paused at the edge of the kitchen, leaning slightly against the counter, my hand resting on the cold surface. I felt the familiar tension rise in my chest. The questions circled in my mind, soft but insistent. Do I intervene? Should I do something? Will it matter? I could almost hear my own voice responding, faint and distant, echoing in my thoughts. Let it be. Just sit. Wait. Observe. The rational part of me wanted to act, to change the course of events, to prevent whatever subtle shift was approaching. But the house, with its quiet persistence, seemed to demand stillness. The shadows lingered patiently in the corners, stretching with the faint flicker of the streetlight outside. Every object, every sound, every faint movement was observed and recorded in my awareness, yet I remained motionless, hesitant. I took a seat at the table, slowly, deliberately, and sipped from my mug. The warmth of the tea grounded me, the sweetness familiar, mundane, almost comforting. My eyes traced the familiar patterns of the room. The light reflecting softly off the polished table, the faint texture of the carpet under the chairs, the subtle shifting of shadows against the walls. I noted each minor anomaly, catalogued each imperfection, and made a choice. I chose inaction. There was no dramatic gesture, no visible decision, only the quiet, deliberate acceptance of the moment. I remained seated, observing, listening, feeling the rhythm of the house, the slow inevitability of change pressing gently against my awareness. The tension was present, persistent, but I ignored it, wrapped in the mundane rituals of tea and conversation, in the habitual movements of my family. I imagined what might happen if I intervened, if I adjusted the chairs, rearranged the objects, corrected the minor disturbances. But the thought felt heavy, burdensome, as though the house itself resisted interference. The rational mind argued, the fearful mind protested, but the final choice settled quietly, almost invisibly. I would do nothing. And with that decision, a strange calm settled over me. The tension remained, but it was accompanied now by a certain clarity, a quiet understanding that the pattern would continue, that the house and its subtle shifts were inevitable. I could sense it in the air, in the faint, persistent cold that brushed against my skin, in the shadows that clung to corners with patient insistence. I watched my family, noting the small gestures, the habitual routines, the quiet comfort of predictability. And I understood, with a slow, deliberate certainty, that the choice I had made was the wrong one, though it carried no immediate consequence, no dramatic event, no sudden horror. It was simple, silent, everyday, and yet, in that simplicity, it was final. I remained at the table, sipping tea, listening to the house breathe around me. Each creak, each faint movement, each subtle shadow reinforced the quiet inevitability of what was coming. And though the world appeared unchanged, I could feel the pattern solidifying, patient, deliberate, inexorable. I stayed there until the clock's hands approached midnight, the familiar rhythm of the house echoing softly through the walls, the shadows stretching and shrinking with the flickering light. I felt the weight of my decision press gently but persistently against my chest. I had chosen stillness over action, and in that choice, I had bound myself to the consequences I could already feel approaching, slow and patient as a tide rising in silence. The air was cold, the tea warm, and the house quiet. And in that quiet, I knew the next shift would come. Morning came slowly, filtered through the thin curtains, pale and uneven. The house was quiet, as it always was in those early hours, but the stillness felt heavier than usual, laden with a sense I could not yet name. I opened my eyes, feeling the chill of the winter air pressing gently against my skin, the faint creak of the floor beneath my bare feet grounding me in reality. The kitchen smelled faintly of last night's tea, of cold metal and wood, and something else, a subtle absence, almost imperceptible, like the empty weight of a missing presence. My hands trembled slightly as I walked through the familiar rooms, touching the surfaces I had traced 1,000 times before. The polished edges of tables, the cool texture of window sills, the soft, worn threads of the carpet. Everything seemed unchanged, yet I sensed immediately that it was not the same. I found the absence where it mattered. One of us was no longer there. Not vanished in a scream, not gone in a dramatic upheaval, but simply gone. The chair at the table sat empty, a small space where warmth and presence had once been. I stood for a long moment, staring at the emptiness, listening to the subtle hum of the house, as if it were aware, as if it had anticipated this. The rest of my family moved through the morning as they always did, speaking softly, eating, performing rituals of ordinary life. They did not mention the absence. I realized then that words were unnecessary, acknowledgement was irrelevant. We had learned, silently, to live within the pattern, to accept it without articulation. I walked slowly through the rooms, touching surfaces, pausing at familiar spots, feeling the cold imprint of absence beneath my fingers. I remembered the decisions I had made, the slow, deliberate inaction at the table, the quiet choice to observe rather than intervene. And I felt, deep in my chest, the weight of inevitability pressing gently, persistently. There was no undoing it. There never would be. The house seemed to exhale with me, its rhythm unchanged, yet altered in some subtle, intangible way. Shadows pooled more densely in the corners, stretching with the flicker of morning light. A faint breeze brushed through the cracked window, carrying the scent of snow and something faintly metallic, something I could not identify. The silence wrapped around me, heavy and patient, holding me in a moment I could not escape. I returned to the living room, sitting in the chair that faced the now empty space at the table. I could feel the rhythm of absence in the air, a persistent echo of something lost. My mind circled again, replaying the choice I had made, the small decisions, the deliberate inaction, and I understood fully, with a slow, suffocating certainty, that the pattern would continue. It was patient, methodical, indifferent to my awareness. I closed my eyes and listened. The faint creak of the floor, the hum of the refrigerator, the subtle whisper of the wind, everything continued as if nothing had changed. And yet, everything had changed. The house, the family, the rhythm of life itself carried a quiet weight now, the invisible imprint of absence and inevitability. I opened my eyes to the pale light, feeling the chill that pressed softly, steadily, against my skin. The silence stretched endlessly, a slow, deliberate presence in the room. I understood that the next shift was inevitable, patient as ever, and that no action, no thought, no intervention could alter it. The emptiness would continue to grow, quietly, persistently, year after year, with each passing new year. I breathed in the cold winter air, letting it fill my lungs, grounding myself in the familiar textures and shapes of the house. And I waited, and the silence remained.